Hi, hello and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to gather. Or I should say moments. I don't think we have minutes, and then we'll get started. Okay, thanks for joining us. Today's webinar on transmission, development, and environmental justice is co-sponsored by Americans for Clean Energy, or ACEG, and the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU. I'd like to thank both of them for convening this important discussion, especially the organizers, Anjali Patel, Hannah Schuster, Jessica Bell, and Carlos Año. As a few housekeeping items, I just want to note that if you have any questions for our speakers, please submit them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them as we're able. Also, this event will be recorded and posted after the event, so you'll have plenty of time to look at it afterwards. Okay, so with that, my name is Christine Powell. I'm the Deputy Managing Attorney for the FERC practice at Earth Justice, which is a public interest law firm with over 200 attorneys across 14 regional offices. And they represent 1,000+ nonprofit and community-based clients on a variety of environmental issues, including climate change. Okay, with that, let me introduce our fabulous panelists. First, let's start with Montina Cole. Montina is the founder and principal of Ja Green Consulting, where she works at the intersections of climate policy, racial equity, and resilience. She was previously the first senior counsel for environmental justice and equity at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. She has also worked at NRDC and spent almost 20 years practicing energy law. Thank you and welcome, Montina. Next, we have Mo Yan Pham. Mo Yan is a New York policy manager for Jobs to Move America. She has a background in community organization, including with the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now and the Texas Campaign for the Environment. Welcome. And next, we've got Jasmine Jennings. Jasmine is a federal affairs attorney at We Act for Environmental Justice. She works to advance legal, policy, and regulatory outcomes for environmental justice communities, including a focus on clean, just, and equitable transition to renewable energy. Prior to joining We Act, Jasmine was a senior associate attorney at Earth Justice, representing environmental justice communities in the Northeast region. Welcome, Jasmine. And finally, we have Kristen Golden. Kristen is the general counsel for Grid United, where she's responsible for the legal strategy and affairs related to transmission development, regulatory issues, governance, and compliance. Kristen has more than 13 years of in-house legal and private firm experience and was previously senior legal counsel for Shell New Energies. Okay, so as you can see, we have a great panel for the discussion today, which will focus on, environmental justice and equity. So there's broad agreement that our nation needs to build more transmission to advance clean energy goals, improve electric reliability, and lower costs. But a clean grid is not inherently equitable. Through redlining and other unjust practices, our nation's energy system has been planned, sited, and operated in ways that disproportionately burden low-income and minority communities and reinforces structural racism. These injustices laid the foundation for how the grid was designed, which is primarily to facilitate transmission of energy from centralized polluting plants, which are disproportionately located in low-income and minority communities, where they cause health, environmental, and economic harms to them. With the goal of lessening these cumulative impacts on affected communities, today we'll discuss how we can build out the grid in an equitable way from the start. Okay, and with that, I will turn first to Jasmine. As I just mentioned, Jasmine, the United States needs a lot more transition to make the clean energy transition happen. How do environmental justice groups view plans for transmission expansion, and what considerations are top of mind for communities that these lines may pass through?
Thanks so much, Christine, and thanks to the State Impact Center as well as ACEG for having us here today. Very excited, and also thankful to my fellow panelists. Great question, and I think we think at WEACT that this question is sort of the heart of the issue, because there is broad agreement, as you mentioned, that we need clean renewable energy. We need a transition, and what we simply say in this context is that we need a transition in transmission infrastructure, a build out that sacrifices no community and serves them all. And that is sort of the baseline of how we approach this conversation. And there are many wonderful and meaningful ways to do that we'll discuss here today. You know, the history of environmental infrastructure in this country has been unkind to low-income Black and Brown, Indigenous, and tribal communities in many ways. And we believe, and we're hearing from environmental justice communities across the country, that there is an exciting way to develop transmission, and that includes community engagement, which we'll talk about here today. That includes uplifting the voices of those that will be housing the infrastructure, and recognizing that a partnership is the goal between the community, between the regulating agency, as well as the project that is coming in. And then it's also about having conversations with those folks. So what are their needs? What is the community like? What is the history of the folks that live there? And how will this project impact that? And again, inviting folks in for a conversation whereby partnership is central. And from there, you can actually create smoother processes. You can create opportunities for folks to weigh in, not just at the beginning, but throughout the process. So I'm sure we'll talk more about this later as well. Thanks, Christine.
Excellent. Thank you, Jasmine. Okay, next I'd like to turn to Kristen. In your experience working for a company that's doing this work on the ground, Kristen, what practices do developers use to engage communities, and can you please share specific ways that Grid United engages with communities throughout the development process?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me on the panel. I think it's really important for developers and NGOs to work together to share ideas about how to develop transmission in an equitable way. Before I get started, just a little bit about Grid United. We're an independent transmission company that's really focused on connecting our three distinct grids. And primarily our projects are interregional utility scale projects. We also strive to engage with communities early on in the development process. This requires a lot of upfront investment, but we think it's worth the risk in order to develop routes that reduce impacts and have buy-in from landowners and key stakeholders at the very start. So one unique thing that we do is we have a landowner first strategy. So we actually start meeting with landowners early in the route development process. This allows us to understand the unique characteristics of the community as well as the property, so that we are able to site our projects in a mutually agreeable location to the extent possible. This is a little bit different from other traditional linear infrastructure because we have all of this engagement upfront before we seek any regulatory approval. One of our projects, the North Plains Connector, is a 385-mile line between North Dakota and Montana. And on this project, we've really lived the landowner first strategy. We introduced the project initially to project commissioners in all 9 counties where we plan to cross. We've held dozens of open house meetings with the community, and we've also established working relationships with federal and state agencies. And all of these relationships have helped us site align and will prepare us for the regulatory process, which will begin later this year. On North Plains Connector, we've also established a community investment program with the North Dakota Community Foundation and a Montana Community Foundation. This program has about $3.85 million that will be spent over the 3-year pre-construction timeline. Each county is allocated a portion of this funding based on the number of miles of transmission that will cross that county. And our foundation partners have set up advisory committees that are comprised of residents representing diverse professions, interests, and causes. And that committee actually will review applications for funding to make sure that funding is used in order to meet local needs. And we've had positive feedback from the community based on our approach, which we hope will mean that we have more support and less opposition as we start the formal regulatory process.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. The landowner first process sounds very efficient and definitely the smart from the start aspects to it. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions on that. Next, I'd like to turn back to Jasmine. So Jasmine, MIT study of renewable projects revealed that while several factors can cause project delays and failures, early engagement with affected communities can minimize local opposition. Why is early engagement with communities so important? And can this outreach start before the route of a transmission line is even decided? Obviously, as Christian mentioned, there's a process that Grid United uses, but if you have other insightful information to add, that'd be great.
Absolutely. And what a perfect segue, Kristen. That sounds really awesome. And I think you highlighted something really important, which is that before final decisions are made, before construction or building begins, let's talk with the community. One example that we use at We Act is if you don't do that, it's sort of like baking a cake and then going back and asking somebody, do they prefer chocolate or vanilla? Once the cake is already done, there's not much you can do. And so hearing about, the way that you all are engaging folks early and first is key. At We Act, we call it first, early, and ongoing engagement. First, getting to the point that you just mentioned and that you mentioned as well, Christine. Early, also getting to that same idea of before things are final. And then ongoing, which is extremely important because the life cycle of these projects is long, and even past construction, communities have different needs and interests and concerns, and most importantly, just want to be kept updated on what's going on and how they can weigh in, and how the project is impacting them throughout the time from pre-filing or building and construction all the way to just ongoing existence in a host community. So having that first, early, and ongoing model ensures that folks feel invited and a part of the conversation and gets to that partnership. The other piece that I'll quickly add is sort of getting to the MIT study and why it's important is that oftentimes, particularly with environmental justice and low-income communities, there are other environmental infrastructure already in place in the community. And there may be a question of cumulative impacts, which is extremely important in the environmental justice context, which is just a simple or maybe a fancy way of saying, looking at all of the environmental burden that a community currently holds. So if we're talking about building transmission in a community that already has a number of other facilities, folks are going to want to know, how will this impact us? How will this impact in terms of the pollutants that we may be experiencing? And even if we're looking at clean renewable energy, that education requirement to let folks know that this is something that's going to help, that's going to combat those GHG emissions, help with resiliency. So it's important for a number of reasons, and one of them being many of our communities are already hosting projects or hosting environmental infrastructure. We want to make sure that they feel safe and heard and in partnership with those that are coming in.
Excellent. Thank you, Jasmine. I'm going to turn back to Kristen again, and I promise folks we'll get to all the panelists, but we're going to turn back to Kristen, kind of keeping along the thread that we're on, Kristen, but maybe focus a little bit on tribal engagement. Can you share some examples of early engagement with tribes?
Sure. So like I said, core to our development philosophy is stakeholder engagement, which includes tribal communities pre-regulatory filings. So we start working with tribes very early. And I think it's important to note that this is distinct from a formal consultation process between the federal government and sovereign tribes. So this is separate. We also think that it's very important that we work with registered members from tribes in the project area. So on the North Plains Connectors, we actually introduced the project to tribal historic preservation officers from participating tribes. We sought their participation in our routing discussions. We also integrated tribal cultural specialists from approximately 15 interested tribes during a field work of our survey season. And then we also hold monthly meetings, project updates for participating tribes as well. If anybody's interested in learning more about our tribal engagement strategy, I'm very happy to connect you with our team who's very passionate about this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kristen. So I'm going to shift to Montina. You're up next. Again, same topic, engagement. That's what we're here to talk about today, but maybe more so from a regulatory context. So Montina, what does meaningful engagement look like? And what can community feedback, how can community feedback be factored into decision-making?
Right. Thank you so much, Christine. And it's really a pleasure to be with you and with everyone here today, the panelists and everybody who's listening in. So yes, meaningful engagement. It is definitely important to understand, to do it, and also to understand not only what it is, what it looks like, but why it's important. And I think a lot of the other panelists have hit on some of this, a lot of it to a good degree. So I'll try to, as you say, focus on the regulatory concept. And when we think about the regulatory concept, we know that environmental justice is what part of the analysis that takes place when agencies are doing a review of a proposed project. The same will prove true when there are transmission projects that come before FERC, for example. Meaningful community engagement is a major component of environmental justice in the agency review context. And we know, just by way of quick background, that environmental justice, though it's been defined in many ways, it's essentially about a few things: just treatment of people, meaningful involvement, here we go, of people, such that they're protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental impacts. So we see right there from the get-go that meaningful involvement is a core part of the concept of environmental justice. And we know when it comes to transmission development, as we've said, it is very much needed because we need to make sure that we bring more renewable resources to the grid, and that we have a more reliable electric grid. And environmental justice implications are going to arise in that context as well. And we see these projects come before regulators such as FERC. And of course, we know that while FERC is not typically in the business of citing transmission projects, now with their new backstop authority, there may have the opportunity to look at some that are designated as natural interest electric transmission corridors, or NITCs, designated by DOE. So when we talk about the EJ analysis, what are we talking about? We're talking about basically three things. One, we want to make sure that we're appropriately and adequately and sufficiently identifying who are the environmental justice communities. And then two, making sure that then we identify what the potential impacts will be that the project will present to those communities. And of course, also the adverse impacts, but also beneficial impacts. And there's many beneficial impacts that can come from transmission. And then thirdly, we want to make sure, to the extent that there are adverse impacts, and there oftentimes and typically are, what are some of the mitigation measures that can be adopted to help mitigate, to avoid, to get rid of any of those adverse impacts? So that's something that is really key to the environmental justice impact. And we'll see how, meaningful community impact is really key, and when we keep that framework in mind. And I want to just quickly, to further contextualize, give a shout out to NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is very much on people's plates here inside the Beltway, and with implications for the entire nation right now, the debt ceiling bill. But the context for meaningful engagement arises out of NEPA. So it's important to understand that context, and to understand that NEPA is about making sure that folks, people, and the agency that's going to be making the decision have sufficient information, that we disclose what the impacts are and everybody understands what's involved. It gives the public the right to that information and the right to be meaningfully involved in participating in the project. So over time, various agency regulations and agency guidance and executive orders have given more context to what that means. And there's a lot of good information. I won't go into all the different guidance, but I do want to flag one in particular that's provided good guidance about what meaningful involvement looks like. And that's a document called Promising Practices for Environmental Methodologies and NEPA Reviews. It's something that was created through an interagency task force some years ago as a way to kind of, again, give more meaning to what we mean by environmental justice in the project review context. And one of the many things that it focuses in on that's very relevant for us here is that they give recommendations for what kind of practices, what kind of policies can we adopt when we're looking at projects. And one of their pieces of guidance is to make sure that we are adaptive and innovative when we talk about approaches to outreach and to engaging with environmental justice communities. And why do we want to make sure that we're adaptive and innovative? Because we know that environmental justice communities are not necessarily situated the same as other folks. They a lot of times have a lot of high barriers to deal with. So they stress to be adaptive, to be innovative. Secondly, promising practices stresses that, and as many people have said, including Jasmine, to start early, begin early, and then continue throughout the process to meaningfully engage with folks. And thirdly, to also make sure that we understand that a benefit of engaging in this way is that we can call on the community and work with the community to help inform the EJ analysis itself. When we're trying to decide, how do we make sure we've identified everybody that needs to be identified? How do we determine the impacts? How do we determine mitigation? The community itself is an expert on many of those things, and engaging with them, we can get their answers to those sorts of things. So those are three things I want to call out about that great piece of guidance that is provided by the federal government in the form of promising practices. And just really quickly, in terms of the early and ongoing piece, I think that's already really been covered by many of the panels. But it's important to do it, especially when we're talking about, transmission. We don't want to wait, for instance, I love that cake analogy that Jasmine mentioned, but we don't want to get the transmission pathway set in stone, right? We want to start before that. We can even start before the scoping process that NEPA that is involved with the NEPA process. We can start as early as possible. Why? Because we want to make sure that any changes, any adjustments that need to be made are made sooner rather than later. It makes for a more efficient process. And two, we want to make sure when we talk about adaptive and innovative approaches, sure, we want to make sure that we reach out to environmental justice communities, bring them in conversation, but not just that we reach out to them, but how we do it is important, right? So if we're going to be giving notices to people about meetings, we want to make sure we're talking in plain speak. We want to make sure we're getting beyond all the technical information and talking in people in language they can understand, making sure that there's multilingual language access. Making sure that when you're bringing in people for a meeting, that how you're meeting is very accessible, starting with how you schedule times, right? You don't want to be meeting in the middle of the day when working people are at work. And, again, many people in our communities aren't necessarily able to take off work in the middle of the day, come to a meeting. So you want to be very, very interested in how you do this. You want to make sure that you provide different modes of participation in terms of meaningful engagement, so that you're doing it probably online, virtual, some in person, some hybrid. You want to make sure that you tailor your approach to the circumstances. In rural or urban context may be different from a rural context, where there may be differences in internet connectivity and things like that. So those sort of details matter, and we can go into more details later. But that's what is important, that we make sure that we adapt to the situation, to the community that we have. Make sure that we're talking to the right folks, community leaders, right? Not just talking to folks who may necessarily just support the project. Make sure that we are really adapting to the situation. So those are just really quickly some of the concepts that I think are important when we try to flesh out what does it mean to meaningfully engage, right? We want to do it on people's terms in ways that really bring in people, as Jasmine said, and make sure that we're really talking to people in a way that works for them. And that goes to help the entire process, not just the community, but it helps the process too.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Montina. I've got a new book for my reading list. I appreciate it. I will get on that immediately. Next question is also for you. Given your recent experience at FERC, what support can the Commission or other federal agencies offer to communities who may be impacted by transmission infrastructure projects?
Right, yeah. Happy to talk about that as well. And I should add, just as a quick footnote too, with respect to that document that I mentioned, promising practices. CEQ has announced that they'll be revising that document. So look out for that. But at the same time, it has a lot of good classic, helpful, useful information. So it still is very much a good resource. So what can we do to support the process? What's needed to facilitate community feedback to make sure that it's factored into FERC's decision-making process? I would say, maybe a couple of things. First of all, I would say that, it's important for us to do all the right things, right? And how we engage with people so that the engagement's really meaningful. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that we demonstrate that there's a difference from where we started in the process to where we ultimately wind up, right? So if folks are giving us their feedback, spending their time engaging in this process, We want to show that there's a difference from, where we started pre-application to where we wind up at the decision point. We want to show folks that their feedback was truly meaningfully looked at and reflected, and that it impacted the process in some way, so that they can see that, it really made a difference. One way we can do that is to, and some agencies do this, develop a summary of community feedback, a summary of community comments, and show how their feedback was factored in, how their ideas were adopted or not, and why. So kind of showing our work, the agency showing its work. And then also, I think the other thing I'll mention too is not just with respect to the process itself, but these processes don't run themselves. It takes staffing to do it. So we want to make sure that agencies are sufficiently staffed up, have enough staff that are dedicated to focusing in on this. Now, note that in FERC's Equity Action Plan, the first ever that I was pleased to help lead the production of that Equity Action Plan while I was there, one of the things that was flagged when we did our equity assessment is that there needs to be more staff capacity around folks who focus on EJ issues and equity issues. So we want to make sure that the agency is sufficiently staffed to be able to run the process in a way that's going to be effective and work for everyone.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Montina. Next, let's talk with Mo Yan a little bit. Mo Yan, I'd like to ask about community benefits agreements. So Jobs to Move America helps develop community benefit agreements. Can you please explain what these are?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for sharing these really thoughtful insights and also for participating in this. And I'll just take a moment to also explain a little bit about Jobs to Move America. So we're a strategic policy center, and we combine strategic research, policy advocacy, and coalition organizing to make sure government spending creates good family-sustaining jobs and healthy communities. We're a national organization, and we do primarily focus on manufacturing. And so the way we've successfully used community benefits agreements has been primarily in the manufacturing sector. We were able to successfully come to an agreement on a CBA with 3 electric bus manufacturing facilities here in North America. And what the CBAs are, they're legally binding agreements that outline specific measurable commitments to the workers and the community. And that's something everyone's been mentioning, right? Workers are part of the EJ community. They're not individual identities, they're combined. And so a community benefit agreement works to address all of those issues. And JMA CBAs tend to focus on making sure there's a pathway created into high quality manufacturing jobs for historically marginalized communities. And our CBAs also contain a commitment to card check neutrality. And what that means is if the workers do choose to unionize, to sign a card to join a union, the manufacturing company won't actively organize against that. So that's what a CBA is. And
great. Thank you so much. And just a couple of follow-up questions, if I can. How does Jobs to Move America go out putting a CBA together, and what can be included in these agreements? I know you mentioned, carbon neutrality provisions, but are there other provisions?
Yeah. So aside from card check neutrality, we've been able to identify like 5 ways to come to a CBA. So first, it's helpful if there's policy or legislation in place that already incentivizes high road corporate behavior. And this can apply to developers and manufacturers. And this opens the door to dialogue. For example, Jobs to America has a policy tool called the US Employment Plan. And it's, transit agencies can use it in their bid process to incentivize the manufacturers bidding on these contracts to commit to good wages, benefits, training. We've also been able to work on legislation. And for example, at the federal level, our national team was able to work with Senator Henrich's office, the senator from New Mexico, around an updated version of his FASTER Act, which is a bill meant to speed up permitting for electric transmission projects, actually. And so his office identified the need for CBA in this legislation, because he wanted to make sure that the communities can reap the benefits of these developments going through them. And it also helps make sure that if there's any concerns around this from the community members, they're already involved in that process, right? And while this isn't, CBAs aren't required, they are, encouraged to come to one, developers. And so the way they're incentivized to do that is, there's a $700 million identified in the Inflation Reduction Act for community development. And so power developers can access this if they successfully negotiate a CBA. So legislation policies help lay that framework and foundation, so it creates a dialogue. And then, of course, there's worker and community engagement. That's what everyone's talking about. You need to start that early. You need to make sure impacted community members are involved in this process. And then relationship building, it's key. It's critical to making sure that everyone has each other's interests in mind, right? So they don't negotiate against each other. And then, of course, there's the busy work, research, education, and outreach. And then, in general, just a shared commitment to supporting workers' communities, like a shared value. And that contributes to how these coalition members are selected to be part of the group, because there's an underlying shared value around making sure the CBA works for everyone. And I'll stop there for a minute.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And just to lead into another question related to what you just spoke about in terms of transmission lines impacting many communities. We know they often span hundreds of miles through many different communities. And so how would you recommend approaching a project where you're trying to build consensus and ensure that one community along the route doesn't get missed when a CBA is being developed?
Yeah, and that's something that comes a lot for community benefits agreements, like how do you successfully implement it, or what are the key components of that? So one, it's shared decision-making. Once again, making sure all the impacted stakeholders are involved and invested in the negotiation process of the CBA. And then clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So for example, you may have 10 groups in a coalition, but there's 5 groups selected to do the actual negotiation for the CBA. And that doesn't mean it just ends there, right? So then those groups negotiating the CBA then have an ongoing open dialogue with the rest of the community groups, to make sure, counter proposals are agreed upon, we agree on what we want to come back with and what goes into the CBA. And then another aspect is identifying what are the key components of the CBA that everyone believes is critical for the system. This could be 3 or 4 or 5 elements. And the idea behind that is to help prevent splintering, right? It's like, sometimes this can happen, one community group thinks, okay, well, I can get X, Y, Z and we're done. But to make sure everyone's in agreement, like, no, successful CBA means all of these components are agreed on in it. And, it's all of it or none of it. And then, of course, ongoing education. As everyone mentioned, like, this needs to happen early and frequently, making sure everyone understands why we're involved in this process, what needs to happen. And then once there is a CBA, tracking reporting of the CBA commitments, right? Just making sure it's actually happening. And then this can happen through quarterly meetings. And this is within the coalition and with the developer. And then lastly, collaboration on additional challenges and solutions. Once again, the idea is like a strong, cohesive coalition. It's critical for making sure that the community benefit agreement is successful and the implementation process occurs over the life of the project and beyond, ideally.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that deep dive on CBAs and sticking with that topic. Jasmine, turning to you, do you have any recommendations for developers and communities interested in using these types of tools? And are there any pitfalls that folks should be careful of to avoid? And then I have a follow-up.
Great. Thank you so much, and great for uplift. Thank you, Mo Yang, for uplifting those great practices. It may be helpful for me to very quickly just share sort of how we act for environmental justice organization. Environmental justice sits within this conversation. So we were originally founded in New York in the 1980s And it was founded by Peggy Shepard, our executive director, and 2 others to address environmental injustices that were happening in New York City in the upper Manhattan area. Since then, we have started a federal policy office, which is here in Washington, D.C., where I sit. And the goal of our office is to advance environmental justice solutions for EJ communities across the country. And so in that space, we hear often from environmental justice communities. We are the anchoring organization for the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which is about 50 EJ organizations from different parts of the country that are working on these exact issues that we're talking about here today, and many others. So we hear from them, but we also are sort of situated in the regulatory space with folks like Christine, wonderful partners at Earth Justice, and other organizations that are sort of looking at how is this process unfolding, what are the regulatory agencies engaged in, FERC, DOE, EPA to a certain extent, the usual characters that folks are familiar with. And in that process, best practices comes up. And so CBAs, like Moyane mentioned, are certainly one of them. And a few others that we think have been particularly helpful is, as Montina mentioned, giving agencies the ability to really work with communities. Within the context of FERC, myself and our colleagues have constantly called for the creation of environmental justice liaisons, as well as tribal and indigenous community liaisons, which are folks that are employed by the agency, but sort of empowered to be a bridge to do all of the things that we've mentioned here today: early engagement, helping facilitate community benefit agreements, or CBAs, providing sort of a space for reciprocal education whereby communities can learn about the project, but also project developers can learn about the community, the heritage, the culture. There was in March a convening by FERC called the Environmental Justice and Equity Roundtable. And FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So many alphabet soups in this work. But in that space, there was an interesting example that I'll very quickly share, where the question was, how can folks best engage? What are the best practices? And one of the community representatives, her name is Rashida Ozane, she's based out of Louisiana, noted that sometimes you have to be prepared for community to ask for things that you may not have thought of or may have not come up in the process. And also the community is the expert on how they can best be supported. And so there was an example about a project developer supporting a Boys and Girls Club program. And Rashida was very eloquently outlining that those sorts of things are helpful, but it's important to first, before setting up such a program, whether it's working with students or starting a Little League team or anything of that nature, to ask the community, is that what you want? Is that the best way that we can engage and be helpful? And if not, what are other ways that we can do it? And then I'll uplift, lastly, a great point, which is sometimes the environmental leaders in a community may not be traditionally housed in an environmental justice organization. They could be faith-based leaders. They could be in any sort of cultural or heritage group. They could be on the school board or in the local chamber or business of commerce. And so just really being intentional about identifying those folks, as Montina, Moyane, and Kristen mentioned, is also another sort of best practice.
Great. And I think you answered the second question. So I'll just move on to a question that's open to all of our lovely panelists. And that is, there are actually 2 questions. How can federal and state governments ensure there is sufficient engagement with communities? And what policy changes would you most want to see? I know, Jasmine, you mentioned the environmental justice, liaison. If you want to expand on that more, that's fine. But also just open it up to others. If you want to raise your hands or come off mute. Montina, yes?
Sure. Great question. And I would say, out of many things, what first comes to mind is a pending notice of proposed rulemaking that FERC has with respect to what regulations are going to govern how they look at transmission projects when they come to them, when FERC is in the position to exercise its authority, backstop authority. Finalize that NEPA finalize that rule, which has a lot of good stuff in it, including a requirement that applicants propose and submit an environmental justice public participation engagement plan. Very, unprecedented, but it's a great thing, a great feature of that proposed rule. So policy-wise, it'd be great to see that NEPA finalized and adjusted as needed to incorporate any of the good comments that have come in with respect to it. There's also a requirement that applicants provide a specific to environmental justice, a resource report that goes into those different prongs of the test that I mentioned, making sure that they're how to show their work in terms of how they've identified the environmental justice communities, to how they've identified the impacts, potential mitigation measures. So that's a great policy piece that I think that will go a long way to support our efforts here. So that's, and also I would say to intervener funding is something that can be very useful from a policy perspective at FERC. It's something that it's possible for FERC to do. They would have to take, some more steps to consider that, and have that in the public sphere to kind of comment on that concept. But that's something that I hope to see FERC do in the future, is to move forward on making sure that folks like environmental justice communities can really participate in a meaningful way. We're very happy that there's the Office of Public Participation now, which is a wonderful thing, helping to get environmental justice communities and others who don't have these big law firms to represent them, to be able to come into the space in a more equitable way. But it can be, there's folks that they pay attorneys and consultants and engineers, the big guys, the big companies, hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars to engage in some of these complex proceedings. Environmental justice communities, by and large, don't have that kind of resources. So I think that intervener funding is kind of can serve as an equalizer and equity piece that will help to further facilitate participation at FERC. And there's a lot of other things I can mention, but those are the two top things I would mention too, in addition to making sure, again, that we have adequate staffing.
Excellent. Thank you, Montina. Would anyone else like to add to Montina's discussion? You hit all the top. Okay, Kristen wants to add.
Oh, I was just, Moyane already mentioned this, but I really think the Faster Act would be helpful, particularly the point on CBAs, because right now the funding that's been appropriated only applies to states, counties, and tribes, and allowing a developer to jointly apply with the community, to me, is kind of the easiest and fastest way to make sure that communities who may not have the resources to seek out this funding on their own get the benefit of this money that's already been appropriated.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we've got quite a bit of questions in the queue already, so maybe I'll turn to those questions and we'll see how much we can get through. Okay, so I'm just going to go in order. Okay, so in regards to enforcement of CBAs, communities are raising questions about enforceability of CBAs. How do you structure them to ensure that communities have a legal remedy when developers do not keep up their end of the deal? Thank you, Dana Johnson, for that excellent question.
I guess I'll jump in first. Yeah, that's always a very good question. And as mentioned, these are legally binding agreements. And so it depends on the terms that are included in there. And they do need to be measurable and in order, like, for example, like the training apprenticeship programs, like that's one thing that you can actually prove whether they did it or not, right? And then another question has come up, like, what if you want them to rehabilitate a park or something like that with funds provided? So you need to be able to negotiate the agreements around like who owns the park, whatever. So, but that's what the whole negotiation process is to make sure that what you are including in that CBA can be, it's what everyone wants, but it's achievable, it's measurable, and there's ways to, report on whether this is happening. So like, same with the whether they're hiring from a certain community group, right? So we were able to include in one of our successful CBAs that 40% of the identified group and 20% of, let me get this correct. Yeah, so 45% of the new hires and 20% of promotions are from historically disadvantaged groups, right? So that's a measurable milestone that you could say is in the CBA. So that there's ways to do it within like in a contract way. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Anyone want to add to that? Okay, let's go to the next question. And I think folks touched on this, the panelists, but maybe if someone has another example. So the question is, can the panelists share examples of creative ways to provide benefits in project development based on input from impacted communities? And I know we touched on it, so hopefully, maybe could just folks can just listen to the session. Okay, so the next question, which is really interesting, how do you address the not in my backyard attitudes, even after a developer has spent time explaining best practices? I know that's not totally germane to environmental justice, but it does come up some, in the context of building transmission. So to the extent that folks have experience with it, let me know if you want to address that question.
Sure. So we try to address that by early engagement and trying to figure out who those individuals are. Is it truly a NIMBY attitude where they don't want the line at all, which would lead us to try to figure out, is there a way around that particular landowner, or do they want the line moved and to accommodate some other activity on their land? That's something else that we can consider doing. So we try to deal with it by early communication, and but that being said, there are landowners that do not want a line, and we are, as a merchant developer, we don't have eminent domain in many cases, and so that's something that we need to know up front, and so we can adjust accordingly.
Thank you, Kristen. Another good question. Sometimes environmental justice communities have limited bandwidth, as we've kind of alluded to earlier. What are some good ways to add to community bandwidth to help communities engaged on transmission and other topics related to energy infrastructure? Martina.
Right. I think in addition to the concept of intervenor funding in terms of something FERC can do, I mean, from the external perspective, DOE is, of course, providing grants for all sorts of different things through the different legislation that's been passed, the IJA and IRA. And, grant opportunities, I think, should be available for communities to participate in these kind of proceedings. I can definitely see a link there if you see that there's been funding provided for a developer to develop these lines or some other mechanism. There should be funding for communities to participate in these proceedings to help to increase their bandwidth. And then lastly, too, I would just mention, I've said this before in other forums, that I think it's really important that our environmental justice communities, our community organizations have sufficient funding. Very happy to see, for instance, We Act that now has Jasmine on board focusing on FERC issues. This was not always the case, right? So I think that there's a growing recognition that these environmental justice issues are very important, increasingly important. And for our advocacy organizations, we want to make sure that they have the resources to be able to represent community interests, and for communities themselves to represent their interests as well. So I think that the philanthropy community should make sure that they continue to increase the resources of our advocacy organizations so that they can participate again in a more even way, equitable and equal way with other folks that are very much more resourced.
Great, thank you so much, Martina. Would anyone else like to add to Martina's answer? Okay, well, let's move on. We do have quite a few questions. This one is also pretty interesting. It takes a little bit of a more tactical approach. So how often do you effectively use local and social media to support your community outreach and engagement initiatives? This might be a good one for Kristen, but obviously open to all panelists.
So, I mean, since you threw it at me, I'm not particularly aware of us using social media in that way, but it's definitely something that we monitor just to make sure we have a good sense of how the community feels about our particular project. I'd imagine as we get further along the development process, that may change and we may take a more active approach there.
Thank you, Kristen. Sorry for putting you on the spot there. Anyone else want to take a crack at it?
I'll quickly just
Sure.
jump in and say I think that's spot on, Kristen, that it's definitely an opportunity there. But you know, this early engagement creates an opportunity to ask the question to the community, how might we best engage with you? And in addition to social media, depending on the age or the demographic of the community, perhaps they're maybe not technologically as savvy, but maybe if you go to a community meeting that happens every third Saturday of the month and speak about the project and sort of share plans, that's another opportunity. In some parts of the country, we've heard from partners, folks are reading newspapers, which is also maybe a way to engage depending on the community. So maybe the core of that is to ask the community first and see sort of what ideas you get back.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is relevant to some of the policy discussions that are happening now and discussions related to the debt ceiling legislation. And so to the extent that folks are following that, if you could respond, so basically what impact will the proposed changes to NEPA have on things that you all are talking about today? That's the precise question. So I think, Montina, you kind of alluded to some of the potential NEPA changes. So I'll maybe start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think, there's certainly a lot of elements to that debt ceiling legislation. And one that I'll focus on in terms of NEPA and regulation is the feature of having basically kind of cookie cutter approach to the time limits for review of projects. Now, certainly when it comes to transmission development, we understand it's needed, right? Of course, it has to go through a certain analysis, but not all infrastructure is created equal. So we're not talking about fossil fuel infrastructure. So we want to make sure that we move these things forward in an efficient way. But I think that there's really a real danger to saying that we're going to move, for instance, just within one year in some instances and get it done, to have this kind of arbitrary truncated deadline, because projects differ. Not every project is the same, they're all unique. So I think there's a danger if we impose strict time limits on agencies, that creates opportunities for reviews to be not necessarily done correctly, for there to, of course, reduce opportunities for good, meaningful, robust engagement with communities. So I think that is a risk that we face if we're going to start imposing these kind of truncated deadlines. I think that one of the things that can help to offset that, again, not to be a broken record, but is to make sure that there's appropriate staffing at the agencies, but also really from the developer perspective as well. You want to make sure that everybody has sufficient staffing on board to really dedicate the time that's needed to engage with the community. So that's one thing I would call out with respect to one of the implications of the debt ceiling bill.
Thanks so much, Montina. Would anybody else like to weigh in? Okay, great. Let's go to the next question. So this is a long one, so bear with me. Long high voltage transmission projects often have to weigh avoiding and minimizing competing impacts and are unable to reconcile all issues with routing. How do you recommend reconciling environmental justice issues with other issues such as natural resource issues that may have a more traditional weight in a NEPA analysis? Yes, Montina.
So if I understood the question correctly, the questioner is asking, how do you weigh environmental justice implications when you're in the context of a NEPA review, when you're doing a review of a project? If that's the question.
Right. And so it looks like there's also this kind of not necessarily countervailing, but other component where there are other issues like, to just say natural resource issues. I'm assuming maybe wetlands are involved or some other natural resource issue. But
Got
maybe
it.
you're right. Let me just read the last part of the question. Sorry.
Okay.
How do you recommend reconciling environmental justice issues with other issues, such as natural resource issues that may have more traditional weight in a NEPA analysis?
Okay, thank you. I think I understand what they're saying. It's really kind of a both and response to that, right? And I would say also that I don't think, and we shouldn't consider EJ issues as being non-traditional, right? Because these communities have always been there. There's always been a need to address the issues of those who are disproportionately adversely impacted. It's just now in more recent years, we're bringing that more to the fore, right? But in the NEPA analysis, you do have to look at all these different relevant factors. And also when we look at the concept of certain resource impacts, whether it's on wetlands, whether it's air quality effects, whether it is effects on water, whether it's effects on the noise from construction, visual impacts, which come up in terms of transmission lines, right? The visual effects. These are all things that don't just impact non-EJ communities, they also can have implications for EJ communities as well. So people are affected, whether we're an EJ community or non-EJ community, through this kind of lens of the different resources, right? So it's all these communities, all communities are impacted in terms of impacts on the environmental resources, if that makes sense. So all these things, there's no necessarily specific formula, at least none that I'm aware of that any agency uses, but there are many, many different factors that do have to be weighed in terms of their impacts on everyone. And that has to be done. Not that one is more important than the other, but the issue of the resource impacts are ones that impact all of us, all communities, including EJ communities.
Excellent. Thanks, Montina. So let's do one more question. It's a really interesting question on rights of way, and then we'll wrap up. The question is, what are your thoughts on the use of existing rights of way for transmission expansion? So for example, highways, railways. Yes,
we've definitely looked at it. I think it's important to keep in mind that, some of those easements do not automatically allow for transmission development. So I think some people characterize that as, something that's pretty easy to do, and that's not necessarily always the case. You also have to look at, can the right-of-way accommodate a new transmission line? So you may find yourself in a situation by being able to partially use the right-of-way, but still having to go out to a sizable number of landowners. I think it's a great idea, but you just have to do your due diligence to see if it's something that you can actually make use of.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm gonna wrap up this really informative discussion by first thanking the panelists who have really deep knowledge in this topic area. And thank you for sharing your time today and all your experience and knowledge. And also thank you to ACEG and the State Energy Environmental Impact Center at NYU for hosting this event. Greatly appreciated, and look forward to many more. Have a great day, folks.